Welcome to lesson 4 of our at home study of history. We are in the 1800s with the 8th grade, and today we're going to carry on from yesterday's lesson, in which we were looking at the events around 1800 in the United States, all the way up to the purchase of Louisiana and the exploration of Lewis and Clark of that territory. So today we carry on and we begin looking at what were the changes that happened between 1800 and 1820. The United States was going through some very, very rapid growth during that period of time. As we talked about yesterday, the United States itself had pretty much doubled in size when Napoleon sold us all of the French territory that was in the center of the country. The Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson not only changed the size of America, but also really changed the scope of what people were focused on. Before that, of course, we remember that the United States was primarily a group of colonies that had declared their independence from Great Britain in the 1700s, and from that point forward began to develop themselves as a new nation under a new constitution with a whole new set of rules and ways of existing as a country. Now we remember that a huge number of the people who were coming over to the United States from Europe at that point in time were experiencing very intense things over in the continent of Europe. Napoleon was conquering many, many countries. A lot of people were obviously concerned about having to go to war. And so, therefore, it was a pretty good time in a lot of people's minds to get out of Europe and move to the new opportunities that America seemed to offer. So, this early 1800s period is a time where a huge number of people start coming into the country. Now, a lot of these people are coming in and obviously going to be looking for some form of work. And so, this is a time where in the Northeast, New England, this massive influx of people turns what used to be relatively smaller sized cities very rapidly into much larger cities. The factories, the mills, all of the effects of the Industrial Revolution begin to accelerate during this period of time. And so, as more and more people are looking for work and looking for a new life, this is a much more appealing place. Now, down in the South, it remained a very agricultural sort of a region. The southern states were still growing a lot of cotton, tobacco, and various other things. But with the invention of the cotton gin, the Industrial Revolution really shifted the South from a place where slavery was starting to die out into a place where slavery actually accelerated in the early 1800s. Suddenly, the cotton gin and the new technology allowed these plantation owners to produce more and more cotton. And the almost insatiable market up in New England and across the ocean in England itself at these newly formed textile mills was making cotton more and more profitable. So we were already seeing from the very beginning a shift in perspective from these two different regions. Cotton, this major and important crop for the South, is going to be driving pretty much all of the decision making of the people in that region. Now, growing cotton was not the only thing that was happening down there. Of course, the Industrial Revolution brought about a huge need for coal in order to power all of these new factories and mills. And so this region of the Appalachians becomes a major producer of coal as well. Now, this coal, of course, in many ways was just being shipped up to factories up to the north. And so there was a real trade in that happening as well. This is a time of massive industrial expansion in terms of cutting canals, forming new railways, and just in general connecting the cities in a new way. There also is a new economic base that is forming because instead of just having wealth connected to land, suddenly during this period we find a lot more ways that people can actually become very successful and very wealthy, whether it's in steel production or whether it's in textiles or whether it's in various other ways that people in an urban setting were able to acquire a lot more money without necessarily being big landowners. Now, in the first part of this period, the United States is going through its rapid expansion, and as I said, across the ocean, uh, England and France are at war. Now, the United States is wanting to ship more and more of its cotton over to these mills in England. It also is wanting to do more trade with France. But England and France, being at war with one another, are trying to prevent the United States with trading with the other country. This ends up leading to the United States having a situation where their ships being going across the ocean are oftentimes being intercepted by British ships, British Navy ships, who are actually taking American sailors off of their ships and forcing them into service in the British Navy. This sort of practice is obviously not a very happy thing for the United States, and begins a real resentment against what was going on. At the same time, a huge number of people are now starting to work their way over the Appalachians and into this territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. This huge new influx of people is obviously moving into territory that was held and lived on by all the Native American tribes who are already there. So we're beginning to see an increased conflict in that area as well. Now, because all of this is going on, the United States government begins to develop an idea that they need to stop this practice, and they're unhappy with Britain both for stealing their sailors, and the British were actually giving weapons and support to the Native American tribes who were in fact going after the settlers who were moving into that territory. So there was a couple of reasons why the United States was getting very upset with Great Britain, and it culminated in the U.S. declaring war against Great Britain in 1812. This, of course, is called the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, the United States, after declaring war, immediately decides that it's going to try and sort out some of the territorial issues that the U.S. was having with Great Britain. And of course, Great Britain were in control of Canada at that time. So when we were in conflict with Canada, we're in conflict with the British Empire. Now, the U.S. goes up there thinking that they're going to sort out some of these problems very quickly, but in fact, the opposite is true. They go to Canada, but they lose a number of battles, and things don't go very well for the U.S. In fact, the British forces not only manage to repulse their attack, they drive down and take the city of Detroit. The British didn't stop there, though. They actually wanted to show the Americans a lesson. And so one of the significant events of the War of 1812 was that the British actually managed to sail all the way into Maryland, into Chesapeake Bay, take over the capital, Washington, D.C., and they even burned down the White House during this period of time. The War of 1812, even though it was fairly significant in those events that were happening, was not really powerful in terms of comparison to the Napoleonic Wars that were going on over there. And the US and Britain fairly quickly managed to sign a treaty in Ghent. But even as that treaty had just been signed, the US and Britain faced off in one final battle. This was the battle for New Orleans. And of course, right down here in the newly taken city of New Orleans, which we had just bought in the Louisiana Purchase, we see a British attack repulsed by a new leader from America, and his name is Andrew Jackson. He becomes a big hero after this battle, and we're going to see later on how he manages to turn that success into a presidency, and finally into a picture on the $20 bill. So these are the major events of the War of 1812 between the U.S. and Britain. But at the same time, the War of 1812 is a time where the Native Americans in this part of the country are actually doing one of their final stands before they get pushed across the Mississippi River. There was a prophet that arises from the Shawnee tribe, and he is beginning to get these visions and share them with the different tribes in this area, in which he envisioned that there was a way to repulse these invaders. Now, by sharing this and gaining a bunch of support, he actually is able to form a group of people around him in a confederacy where different tribes who traditionally might have been warring with one another are finally now going to unify against their common enemy, which is all of these Americans who are coming across and starting to settle in their territory. They're politically led by a man named Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a great and very inspiring leader, and he actually was very successful in not only training but also rallying a huge number of people who, like I said before, would probably have been fighting each other. Their common mission ends up culminating in building of a town called Prophetstown. So his brother is the prophet. Tecumseh has gathered together all these different tribes to stop this westward migration. And he is basically getting to a point where he's thinking he can finally stop this with the support of British weapons and training. Well, Tecumseh was actually away when William Henry Harrison, who is another later president, comes into what would become Indiana and brings with him about 1,000 U.S. soldiers. The soldiers set up and begin a negotiation, but the next day, when they were supposed to meet, the daybreak finds a group of the Native American warriors coming across and attacking their camp. There was a long battle that was drawn out, and in the long run, the Native American tribe was basically, they ran out of ammunition, they ran out of steam, and they ended up having to retreat. Harrison then takes the army into Prophetstown, burns the place to the ground, and drives them out of that area. Tecumseh wasn't done, and he definitely continued to force his battle until finally his life and his whole confederacy culminate in a major battle called the Battle of the Thames. In the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh and his confederacy are finally defeated. He is killed, and the remainder of this group end up having to flee across the Mississippi River. Now, this leads to a new America. So in our previous map, we were looking at the map as it looked in 1800. And by now, the map that we're looking at that reflects more 1820, we can see that we've made a number of different changes. First of all, Florida now has been taken by the United States as a new state. Florida, of course, had been controlled for a long, long time by the Spanish, but when the Spanish were dealing with Napoleon over in Europe, and they were under siege themselves, they found that they were unable to really protect all of their colonies in the New World. And so as a result, the Spanish have to really kind of give up on a lot of their colonies. Now, Florida was a place where they had stationed a bunch of troops, but all of their other colonies, both in Mexico, moving down into Central America and South America, are all kind of revolting against them at the same time. They all want their independence and freedom, and Spain just doesn't have the resources to really prevent that. So we see in this period that the revolutions that define this age, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, can also be joined by all the colonial revolutions that fall one after another as Spain is basically sent away from the New World. In that process, the United States gains Florida. Now, right across over here, after the Louisiana Purchase, we end up with the state of Louisiana itself, which obviously at that time was centered around the very important port city of New Orleans. We had just heard about how Andrew Jackson had fought his battle in 1815 for New Orleans. This is, of course, an incredibly important place for the United States. Mississippi and Alabama joined the Union in territory that had been disputed between the country and Georgia. And then, of course, up here, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois now become new states as well. Michigan territory is still remaining a territory, but eventually, of course, that will become Michigan and Minnesota. So here we have all of these states that are newly formed. One of the biggest issues that we see as the country is going into this era is that as more and more people come in, the government is having to deal with how do we maintain a balance between slave and non-slave states. This was a huge debate that was going on in the country early on in the 1800s, and would just keep building and building until the culmination of the Civil War. So 1820 is significant as a date because after a huge amount of back and forth, in 1820 the United States government finally comes up with something called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. A new state of Missouri was wanting to be formed. The U.S. had set up a situation where if you had a certain number of citizens that moved into your area and basically were kind of signed up and able to vote, then at a certain critical mass, you could actually declare yourself a state and join the Union. Well, the rest of the states obviously had a say in all of this, and so there was a big battle that began to be developed between the slave states of the South and the states of the North, who were oftentimes, almost universally, opposed to slavery. The North didn't need slavery, they had a huge influx of workers. And at this time, there is even this idea called the indentured servant. And indentured servitude meant that someone, usually from Europe, was able to go and gain passage across the Atlantic, even if they couldn't afford the trip. They could essentially sell themselves for a period of time. So they would be able to make this journey across the Atlantic, get to the New World, and then they would be set up in a job where they were borderline a slave, but they eventually could work their way free or work their way out of their servitude. So this is a way that a lot of people are now coming into that part of the world, the Northeast. So these states of the Northeast are definitely very opposed to the idea of slavery. The slave states in the South are very opposed to anyone telling them what to do, and the U.S. is set up with a very difficult crisis that's going to be hard to sort out, because each side is dug in and believes that they're absolutely correct. The Missouri Compromise basically harbors around the idea that there were 11 slave states and 11 non-slave states. And so therefore, when Missouri comes into play and there's a desire to incorporate this new state, all of the free states say that no, you cannot change the balance here and have more slave states than free states. The Missouri Compromise had to do with the idea that by admitting Missouri as a slave state, we then added Maine, which used to be part of Massachusetts, as a free state. And so this was part of the compromise. Also, a big part of this compromise was trying to define in the future, as new states were added, could they be slave or non-slave? So they marked a line that went across the country and said, above this line, except for Missouri, anything north of that will no longer be allowed to have slavery. So this 1920 compromise was a political move in order to try and define or also to try and stave off this inevitable march towards war that the country was going on. Up in the unorganized territories, as they called them at this point, people were, of course, moving in there as well. The country had opened up, and so all of these people who wanted to go explore, who wanted to try and take new land, were starting to move into this territory. All the way over here, ever since Lewis and Clark had managed to make their way to the Pacific Ocean near Portland, modern-day Portland, Oregon, this region becomes called Oregon Country. And so it's still a very wild land up there, but the United States and Great Britain, through Canada, are trying to figure out who owns what and what territory belongs to whom. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820 ultimately staves off a question that is still going to have to be answered. The United States has temporarily come up with a solution, but it's one that's not going to last or work in the long run. And so our country will continue to march towards the inevitable Civil War.